Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about the sheer audacity required to be the ruler of a newly formed country, and within your first decade in power, the greatest, most expansive military machine in human history knocks on your door.
Right. And they hand you a letter.
Exactly. They hand you a letter, and this letter is not negotiation. It is an absolute demand for total, unconditional surrender.
Yes.
Now, if you're the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Qutuz, in the year 1260, you do not write a letter in return. You don't convene a council to debate the merits of capitulation. You take those envoys, you cut them in half, and you mount their heads on Bab Zuela.
Which was one of the massive stone gates of Cairo.
Right there for the entire city to see.
And by executing those envoys, Qutuz essentially locked the gates behind him. I mean, he guaranteed that the full weight of the Mongol war machine would eventually turn its sights toward Egypt.
Because they had just eradicated the centuries-old Abbasid Caliphate, right, and marched effortlessly through Syria.
Exactly. There was no going back from a provocation of that magnitude. It was a definitive statement.
And that single brutal act ignited a war that dictated the borders of the Middle East. It's a conflict that spanned roughly from 1260 to 1323. So today our mission is to explore the Mongol invasions of the Levant. We're going straight into the deep dive of this multi-generational clash.
We really want to see if the seemingly unstoppable Mongol cavalry could be halted by this newly formed state of former slave soldiers, the Mamluks.
Yeah, and we have a massive stack of sources for this deep dive. We're looking at military history accounts that break down cavalry tactics, logistical analyses of the Syrian climate.
The climate is huge here.
It really is. Plus, we have diplomatic correspondence sent between the Mongol Ilkhans and European monarchs, and chronicles from Arabic, Latin, and Armenian writers who actually lived through it.
So for you listening, this is really an exploration into the physical and logistical limits of empire. It's a study of how an army with, overwhelming technological and numerical dominance can be utterly neutralized by environment, by geography.
And by an adversary that fundamentally understands institutional discipline.
Exactly.
So let's start by looking at the landscape before the Mongols even arrive. Because if you look at the Levant leading up to the 1250s, you see a region that is deeply politically fragmented.
Highly fragmented.
The dominant power at the time is the Ayyubid dynasty. This is the empire founded by Saladin back in the late 12th century. But by the mid-13th century, it has fractured into this loose confederation of autonomous principalities.
Right. You have Ayyubid princes ruling in Aleppo, Damascus, Hama, and Homs. And they are constantly at each other's throats.
It's somewhat like a massive family business where all the heirs are aggressively suing each other over the inheritance.
That's a good way to put it.
They're entirely unprepared for a hostile corporate takeover.
Yeah, the Ayyubid Confederation functioned much more as a collection of city-states bound by loose family ties, rather than any sort of centralized, cohesive empire.
So their military reflected that.
Completely. Their armies were composed of freeborn Arab and Kurdish infantry, Turkic cavalry contingents, and Bedouin irregulars. These princes spent decades fighting minor skirmishes.
Mostly against each other, right?
Yes, not just against the remaining Crusader states clustered on the Mediterranean coast, but frequently against their own relatives. I mean, they would routinely form temporary alliances with the Crusaders just to gain leverage over a cousin ruling the next city over.
That is a mess. So while the Ayyubids are squabbling up in Syria, a massive political earthquake happens down in Egypt in 1250.
The Mamluks seize power.
Right. And we need to spend some time unpacking exactly who the Mamluks were, because their identity, their upbringing, and their training, that's all central to understanding how they fought.
It's vital. The term Mamluk translates essentially to one who is owned. But we have to be careful with the word slave here.
Because it's not chattel slavery in the way it's often understood in more modern contexts.
Exactly. These were military slaves. They were primarily Kipchak Turks and Circassians, purchased as young boys from the Eurasian steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caucasus.
So the Ayyubid rulers would import these youths to Egypt, convert them to Islam, and put them through a rigorously institutionalized military training program.
Right, so you're taking boys who already come from a nomadic, horse-centric culture.
These kids probably knew how to ride before they could walk.
Exactly the point. They start with a baseline of steppe survival skills. But once they get to Egypt, they were taught a martial discipline known as Ferusia.
And Ferusia isn't just basic combat training, right? It's highly formalized.
Oh, it was a highly formalized system. It encompassed advanced horsemanship, archery, lance combat, and unit tactics. We're talking about drills where riders had to hit multiple targets with arrows while riding at a full gallop.
That is intense.
Or they would practice highly coordinated, heavy cavalry charges using lances. They were heavily armored, highly disciplined, and completely professionalized.
So they're essentially an elite Praetorian Guard.
Yes, very much so. And upon completing their training, they were legally freed, but their primary loyalty remained strictly to the master who bought and trained them, and deeply to their fellow regiment members.
Fostering an intense brotherhood.
A very tight brotherhood. And in 1250, during the chaos of the Seventh Crusade, a specific Mamluk regiment known as the Bahriya realized something very important.
Let me guess. They realized they were the ones with all the weapons.
Exactly. They held the actual military power in Egypt. The Ayyubid rulers were just figureheads at that point. So the Mamluks assassinated the last Egyptian Ayyubid ruler, Turanshah.
And they took control of the state apparatus themselves.
Right. So you have a newly established, highly militarized regime sitting in Cairo.
Meanwhile, the Ayyubid princes up in Syria are looking down at Egypt, and they're viewing these Mamluks as completely illegitimate usurpers.
Yeah, they see them as former slaves who murdered their master. It creates a massive ideological and political rift within the region right when they need unity the most.
Because while the Middle East is dealing with this internal regime change, the real storm is gathering in the East, the Mongol Empire.
Right. Under the directive of Great Khan Munka, the empire decides it's time to consolidate definitive control over the Islamic world.
And Munka gives this task to his brother, Hulagu Khan. So in 1256, Hulagu launches his western campaign.
And Hulagu's army was formidable. Contemporary sources estimate the force at over 100,000 troops.
That is a staggering number for that era.
It is a massive expeditionary force drawn from across the vast Mongol Empire. It even included specialist siege engineers from China and Persia.
So what was his first target?
His first major objective was the Nizari Ismaili strongholds, commonly known as the Assassins, located in the Alborz Mountains of Persia.
Right. Because for decades, the assassins had utilized targeted political murder to maintain their independence from various empires. They built these supposedly impregnable mountain fortresses.
But the Mongols did not engage in the kind of asymmetrical warfare the assassins were used to. Hulagu systematically besieged and dismantled their network.
Just bringing overwhelming engineering and manpower to bear.
Exactly. This campaign culminated in the fall of their primary fortress, Alamut, in late 1256. And with the assassins neutralized, the Mongols secured their supply lines and their flanks.
Which clears the path for Hulagu to march on the intellectual and administrative center of the Islamic world, which is Baghdad.
Yes. In 1258, Hulagu lays siege to the city. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, refuses to submit unconditionally.
He believes the wider Muslim world will ride to his rescue, doesn't he?
He does, but they do not. And the result is the total sack of Baghdad. The destruction of Baghdad is a pivotal moment in global history. I mean, the Abbasid Caliphate had existed in some form for 5 centuries.
It was the symbolic heart of Sunni Islam.
It was. The Mongols breached the walls and they executed the caliph by rolling him in a carpet and having horses trample him.
Which is such a specific and brutal method.
It was actually chosen to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth, according to Mongol custom. But then they plundered the city, the libraries were destroyed, the infrastructure was ruined, and a significant portion of the population was massacred.
Wait, hold on. I have a question about this.
Sure.
If you are an Ayyubid prince sitting in Damascus or Aleppo, and you just watched a 500-year-old empire get swatted away like a fly,
Right.
why on earth do you not immediately call your cousins, call the Mamluks, call anyone with a sword, and form a massive coalition? Why wait for the Mongols to cross the Euphrates?
It is a logical question, but it requires us to step into the highly localized mindset of a 13th century Ayyubid prince.
Okay, walk me through that.
These rulers had survived for decades by balancing threats. They played the Crusaders against each other, they played their cousins against each other, they relied on making separate, highly localized arrangements.
So they didn't think globally.
No, they had no framework for a unified existential defense because they had never faced a unified existential threat of this magnitude.
So they were treating the Mongols like just another regional player they can negotiate with.
To an extent, yes. Furthermore, we have to look at the mechanics of the Mongol terror strategy. It was explicitly designed to paralyze decision-making and prevent coalitions.
How so?
The Mongol message was uniform and consistently delivered. Resistance meant complete, systematic annihilation of your city and your populace. Submission, however, meant survival.
And survival meant keeping your stuff.
Mostly. It meant you often retained your local power, your title, and your life as long as you accepted status as a vassal to the Great Khan.
So the incentive structure is incredibly skewed. I mean, if you unite and fight, you might still lose. And if you lose, everyone dies.
Exactly.
But if you just quietly submit, you get to keep sitting in your palace. You just pay taxes to a different boss.
Precisely. Individual rulers were deeply incentivized to wait, hope the Mongols targeted someone else, or attempt to negotiate their own survival rather than risk total destruction in a unified stand.
Especially since that stand required trusting rivals they had been fighting for years.
Exactly. It was a prisoner's dilemma, and the Mongols exploited it perfectly.
That sets the stage for late 1259. Hulagu's army crosses the Euphrates River into Syria.
He brings his massive force, which by now includes Armenian and Georgian vassals who had previously submitted to the Mongols. They advance straight toward Aleppo.
And the siege of Aleppo begins in January 1260. This is where we see the Mongols utilizing warfare that goes far beyond their famous light cavalry horse archers, right?
Oh, far beyond. They brought highly sophisticated siege engineering. Hulagu utilized Chinese and Persian specialists who constructed massive earthen ramparts known as chapar.
Let's break down what a chapar actually is, because when you say earthen ramparts, it sounds like they're just piling dirt.
It is an immense engineering feat. The defenders of Aleppo are firing arrows, dropping rocks, and using naphtha from the city walls.
Naphtha being early Greek fire, basically.
Right. And against that, the Mongol siege engineers conscript thousands of local laborers and force them to build enormous sloping mounds of earth and timber right up against the city's defenses.
Wow. I mean, that is just brutal. They use local laborers as a human shield while building it.
Exactly. And they build these ramps higher than the city walls themselves. Once the chopper is built, the Mongols drag their own siege engines, trebuchets, and ballistas up to the top.
So from that elevated position, they can continuously and relentlessly bombard the interior of the city.
Yes, and batter the walls from a superior angle.
You are essentially building a mountain next to a city just so you can shoot down into it. That is terrifying.
It was highly effective. The bombardment lasts for a week before the city's outer walls fall. The citadel holds out for another 40 days, but the fate of the city is sealed.
And once they take full control, the Mongols execute a massive slaughter, specifically targeting the adult male population.
Yes, this was a calculated demographic eradication. It was not mindless violence. It was a policy designed to prevent any future uprising.
Because if you remove the men of fighting age, the city cannot rebel for at least a generation.
Right. The artisans, engineers, and specialized craftsmen were often spared and deported east to work for the Mongol Empire, but the defending forces and the general male populace were systematically killed. Aleppo, one of the jewels of northern Syria, was left in ruins.
And the news of what happened at Aleppo travels south to Damascus very quickly.
Very quickly. The Ayyubid ruler of Damascus, al-Nasir Yusuf, essentially panics and flees, leaving the city to fend for itself.
So the notables of Damascus, the civilian leaders and merchants, they decide they want absolutely no part of what happened to Aleppo. They send emissaries with the keys to the city out to the Mongols.
And they surrender without a fight in March 1260. Because of their peaceful surrender, Damascus was spared the total destruction and mass slaughter that Aleppo endured.
So the architecture and general population survived.
Yes, but the city was still heavily looted. The Mongols seized the treasuries, imposed incredibly heavy taxation on the citizens, and installed a Mongol commander named Kitbuka to govern the city alongside a local puppet administrator.
Okay, this is the part that I find confusing. Damascus hands over the keys to avoid being sacked, and the Mongols rob the treasury and tax them into poverty anyway.
Right.
What kind of deal is that? If you are going to lose your wealth regardless, doesn't that defeat the incentive to surrender?
This requires understanding the Mongol imperial worldview, which was absolute. To the Mongols, there were no equal nations, no sovereign states, and no treaties between peers.
There were only subjects or rebels.
Exactly. The Great Khan had a divine mandate to rule the entire earth. If you surrendered, you were merely acknowledging the natural order of the world. Surrendering spared your population from being massacred, which was the standard punishment for the crime of rebellion.
But money.
As subjects of the empire, your wealth, your grain, your horses, and your resources rightfully belonged to the Mongol war machine. To the Mongol commanders, taking the treasury of Damascus was not looting.
Because looting implies stealing.
Right. They were simply collecting taxes that were already theirs by divine right.
They're essentially saying, congratulations, you are now part of the empire. Please hand over the taxes to fund our next conquest.
That's precisely how they viewed it.
But right as the Mongols have secured Syria and seem poised to push down the coast into Egypt, a massive geopolitical shift occurs thousands of miles away.
Yes. News arrives from the Far East that the great Khan Munka has died during a campaign in China.
And the death of a great Khan is the one thing that reliably halts Mongol expansion, isn't it?
It is. Mongol tradition required all senior members of the ruling family, the Borjigin, to return to the Mongol heartland for a Kurultai.
A Kurultai being a massive political council.
Yes, where the elite gather to negotiate, politic, and ultimately elect the new leader. Hulagu, as Munka's brother, was heavily invested in the succession crisis.
So he takes the bulk of his massive army and marches back east toward Persia and Azerbaijan.
Right, to monitor the situation and position his forces, leaving his trusted general Kitbuka in charge of Syria.
Hulagu takes the overwhelming numerical advantage with him. Estimates suggest Kitbuka is left with only 10,000 to 20,000 Mongol troops, plus some local vassal forces from Georgia and Armenia.
It is a critical reduction in force. Kitbuka goes from commanding an overwhelming, unstoppable horde to managing a much smaller occupational army, spread out across garrisons in Syria and Palestine.
And down in Cairo, the Mamluks, who have just recently executed the Mongol envoys and committed themselves to a fight to the death, they recognize this rare window of opportunity.
They know Hulagu has left. Sultan Qutuz mobilizes his forces immediately. Qutuz gathers an army of approximately 20,000 Mamluks.
Which puts them on relatively equal numerical footing with Kitbuka.
Yes, and Qutuz makes a bold strategic decision. Rather than waiting defensively in Egypt for Kitbuka to march across the Sinai Desert, Qutuz decides to advance into Palestine to meet the Mongols on his own terms.
Now, to do this, Qutuz has to march his entire army right past the remaining Crusader strongholds on the Mediterranean coast, specifically the Kingdom of Jerusalem's remnants at Acre.
And this leads to a fascinating diplomatic moment. The Crusaders and the Mamluks are bitter, generational enemies. They have been fighting holy wars against each other for decades.
But they strike a temporary, passive truce.
The Frankish barons in Acre had a very difficult debate. They received overtures and demands from the Mongols, but they also recognized that the Mongols had recently devastated Christian lands in Eastern Europe.
Right. Hungary and Poland had been ravaged just a couple of decades prior.
Ultimately, the Crusaders concluded that the Mongols represented an unpredictable existential threat that wanted total submission. The Mamluks, on the other hand, were a known, localized adversary.
The devil you know.
Exactly. The Franks made a pragmatic choice. They allowed the Mamluk army to safely pass through their territory and even permitted them to purchase essential supplies, like food and fodder, from Crusader markets.
The Mamluks advance and intercept Kitbuka's forces on September 3rd, 1260. They meet at a place called Ain Jalut, which translates to the Spring of Goliath, located in the Jezreel Valley.
The topography of Ain Jalut was essential to the Mamluk strategy. If you picture the Jezreel Valley, it provides a wide enough flat plain for large cavalry maneuvers, which both armies required.
But crucially, it is bordered by hills and uneven terrain.
Yes, where troops could be effectively concealed. Qutuz placed his vanguard, commanded by his brilliant and aggressive general Baybars, out in the open to engage the Mongol forces.
And Baybars engages Kitbuka's vanguard. After a brief, intense skirmish, Baybars orders his troops to turn around and flee. The Mongols, seeing the enemy panic, charge aggressively after them.
But it is a trap. It is a classic steppe tactic. The feigned retreat.
Let's emphasize how incredibly difficult a feigned retreat is to execute properly.
Oh, it's insanely difficult. You have thousands of men on horseback fighting for their lives. The noise is deafening. The dust is blinding.
And to order those men to turn their backs to the enemy, absorb arrow fire, and pretend to run away in sheer terror without the formation actually breaking down into a real chaotic rout.
That requires absolute ironclad discipline. This is where that institutionalized Furushia training paid off.
Because if even one regiment actually panics and runs for real, the whole army collapses.
Exactly. Baybar's vanguard successfully draws the Mongol forces deep into the valley, stretching the Mongol lines and pulling them away from their defensive positions.
And once the Mongols are fully committed to the chase and completely out of position, Qutuz orders his hidden reserves to flank the Mongol forces from the surrounding hills.
The trap springs shut.
The Mamluk drums start pounding to signal the counterattack, and the heavy cavalry charges down from the high ground. The combat stops being a mobile archery duel and becomes incredibly brutal hand-to-hand fighting.
The Mamluks are using heavy lances and maces. Kitbuku realizes he is completely surrounded, but he refuses to retreat.
He fights in the melee until his horse is killed, right?
Yes, and he is struck down on the battlefield. With their commander dead, the Mongol army disintegrates and the survivors scatter and flee northward.
The Battle of Ain-Jalut is an absolute watershed moment in military history. It shattered the psychological myth of Mongol invincibility.
It was the first time a Mongol advance was permanently halted, and the territory they had conquered, Syria, was immediately reclaimed by the victors. Within weeks of the battle, the Mamluks marched into Damascus and restored Muslim control over the region.
But there's a very dark, very practical epilogue to this glorious victory.
There always is.
On the journey back to Cairo to celebrate, Qutuz is assassinated by Baybars and a group of Mamluk emirs.
And Baybars then rides into Cairo and declares himself the new Mamluk Sultan. It is a ruthless political system.
Highly ruthless. But focusing on the military aspect of Ain-Jalut, you have the Mamluks using the Mongols' own signature tactic, the feigned retreat against them. It makes me wonder, were the Mamluks simply better Mongols than the Mongols themselves?
That is a very compelling way to frame the dynamic. The Mamluks possess the exact same foundational skill set as the Mongols.
Because of the slave trade origins.
Right, because so many of the Mamluks were Kipchak Turks, purchased from the Eurasian steppes. They were raised in the same nomadic, horse-centric culture. They had the same innate understanding of horsemanship, the same composite bows, the same ability to shoot from the saddle.
So they are playing the exact same game.
They are, but the Mamluks took those raw, intuitive steppe skills and subjected them to rigorous, standardized, institutional professional training in Egypt.
Plus the equipment difference.
Exactly. They were equipped with heavier armor chainmail and lamellar, and specifically trained for disciplined, close-quarters, heavy cavalry charges.
Whereas the Mongols relied heavily on light cavalry tactics.
Keeping their distance, avoiding melee, and wearing the enemy down with constant, punishing arrow fire.
So at Ain-Jalut, once the feigned retreat pulled the Mongols in, the Mamluks forced them into a close-quarters brawl, where Mamluk heavy cavalry discipline and superior armor proved decisive.
Precisely.
So Ain-Jalut is a massive victory. But the Ilkhanate, the southwestern sector of the Mongol Empire established by Hulagu, still exists right across the Euphrates River in Persia.
Hulagu is still alive, he still has vast armies, and the Mongols have access to the resources of a continent.
Right, so why didn't they just wait a year, gather 100,000 men, return to Syria, and crush the Mamluks through sheer numbers?
To understand this, we have to look at what you could call the invisible shield, the logistics, geography, and climate of Syria.
Logistics dictated the entire rhythm and ultimate outcome of the Mamluk-Mongol War, didn't it?
Entirely. The Mongol military machine was entirely dependent on immense herds of horses. A single Mongol warrior did not just ride one horse. He traveled with a string of 5 to 15 remounts.
To maintain speed.
Yes, this allowed them to rotate horses constantly, ensuring they always had a fresh mount, which maintained their incredible strategic speed over long distances.
Let's do the math on that because the numbers are staggering. If a Mongol commander brings an army of just 10,000 men to raid Syria, he is bringing between 50,000 and 150,000 horses.
And if Hulagu brings an army of 50,000 men, you are dealing with potentially 500,000 horses moving across the landscape.
500,000 horses, and all of those animals require massive amounts of water and grazing land every single day.
A horse can easily drink 10 gallons of water a day. Multiply that by 100,000 horses.
And the Syrian climate, particularly in the summer, is characterized by extreme heat, a severe lack of surface water, and highly concentrated, insufficient grazing lands.
The environment simply cannot support that kind of biomass.
And Sultan Baybars, who took over after assassinating Qutuz, understood this ecological vulnerability completely.
He did. He initiated a brutal strategy of scorched earth. The Mamluks established specialized incendiary units known as al-Murakat.
And their entire job was to systematically burn the grasslands of northern Syria from Aleppo all the way to the Euphrates River.
By turning the landscape into ash, Baibars was deliberately depriving the Mongol horses of vital fodder. There is a very notable event in 1262 that illustrates this.
What happened?
Baibar's spies and the Mamluks maintain a highly effective, deeply embedded espionage network across the border, reported that Hulagu was mobilizing a large army in Persia. It was unclear if Hulagu was heading west for Syria or marching north to the Caucasus.
And Baybars does not wait to find out their destination.
Mhm.
Rather than just reinforcing castle walls and hoarding grain in the cities, he orders his Almorakat forces to incinerate the grazing lands in a 10-day march radius around Aleppo.
He preemptively destroys the very fuel the Mongol war machine needs to function. The environment itself was weaponized.
Because if the Mongol horses starved, the Mongol army could not move, they could not execute their sweeping cavalry tactics, and they could not survive their retreat.
Exactly.
If you think about an invading army crossing a desert in a fleet of heavy, gas-guzzling tanks, the Mamluk strategy is essentially blowing up every single gas station for hundreds of miles before the enemy even crosses the border.
That analogy captures the logistical reality perfectly. The tanks are completely useless without the fuel, no matter how good the armor is. Warfare, especially in this era, is ultimately dictated by the absolute limitations of biology and environment.
The Mamluks recognized that they did not always need to defeat the Mongols in a pitched battle where they might be outnumbered. They simply needed to make the land so inhospitable that the Mongol army defeated itself.
And it was not just the brutal summer heat that formed this invisible shield. The winter weather also caused massive problems for the Mongol cavalry.
Right, there was an attempted raid near a town called Herim in 1263.
The Mongol and Armenian cavalry got completely bogged down by heavy snow and torrential rain. They suffered heavy losses just from the weather conditions, horses freezing or getting stuck in deep mud.
The Levant presented a very narrow operational window for the Mongols. Summer was too dry and lacked pasture, leading to starved horses.
And winter brought mud and freezing rain that neutralized their mobility and ruined their composite bows, which could delaminate in heavy moisture.
So they generally had to time their major invasions for the brief transitional periods in autumn or spring when pasture was available, but the severe weather had not set in.
Which made their movements highly predictable to Mamluk scouts.
While the terrain and climate provided a natural defense, Baybars knew he could not rely on the weather alone to save his empire.
No, the Mongols would eventually adapt.
So the Mamluks had to engage in high-level geopolitical maneuvers to attack the Mongols where it really hurt their internal politics. This brings us to a massive diplomatic chessboard involving the Golden Horde to the north and the Crusader states to the west.
Yes. Following Great Khan Munk's death and the subsequent succession struggles, the unified Mongol Empire began to fracture into four distinct, often hostile khanates.
The Ilkhanate, ruling over Persia and the Middle East, found itself sharing a massive, tense border with the Golden Horde to the north, which controlled the steppes of Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus.
And the ruler of the Golden Horde, Burt Khan, had formally converted to Islam. He was reportedly absolutely outraged by Hulagu's sack of Baghdad and the execution of the Abbasid Caliph.
Burt Khan felt that Hulagu had profoundly overstepped by shedding the blood of the spiritual leader of the Islamic world and massacring Muslims.
This deep ideological rift, combined with intense territorial disputes over the lucrative pasture lands of the Caucasus region, led to open conflict. The Burk-Hulagu War erupted in 1262 and lasted until 1266.
It was a brutal civil war between two massive Mongol states, and Baybars sees this civil war happening and immediately capitalizes on it.
He sends diplomatic envoys to Burt Khan, establishing a formal alliance between the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and the Mongol Golden Horde in Russia.
This alliance was a strategic masterstroke by Baybars. By coordinating with the Golden Horde, Baybars essentially created a two-front war for the Ilkhanate.
He forced Hulagu to constantly look north over his shoulder. Hulagu had to divert his best troops, his most experienced generals, and his massive horse herds to the Caucasus frontier to fight his own cousins.
Rather than focusing his full military might on conquering Syria.
Exactly.
At the same time, the Ilkhans in Persia are trying to forge their own alliances to counter the Mamluks. If the Mamluks are looking north, the Ilkhans look west to the Christian powers of Europe.
For decades, the Ilkhans repeatedly sent envoys, letters, and gifts to European monarchs, kings of France, England, Aragon, and to the Pope, proposing a Franco-Mongol alliance.
And the Mongol diplomatic pitch to Europe was very straightforward, at least on the surface. You want Jerusalem. We want to crush the Mamluks. Join us in a massive coordinated naval and land attack against Egypt and Syria, and in return for your military assistance, we will hand Jerusalem and the Holy Land back to the Christians.
We see this actually play out in a very limited way during the Ninth Crusade in 1271.
Right. Prince Edward of England, who later becomes King Edward I, arrives in the Levant with a small crusader force.
He formally requests aid from the Ilkhan at the time, Abaka Khan. Abaka actually agrees and sends a force of about 10,000 men under a general named Samagar to assist Edward.
However, the operation was a complete tactical failure.
Completely uncoordinated. The Mongol raids arrived at different times than Edward's forces. They engaged in some highly destructive raids around Aleppo, pillaging the countryside, but they failed to capture any significant Mamluk fortresses or cities.
And they eventually withdrew across the Euphrates the moment Baybars marched a large Mamluk relief army north from Damascus to meet them.
Right.
This raises a massive question for me. You have the European Crusaders and the Mongol Ilkhanate who share a mutual, highly capable enemy in the Mamluks. They are writing letters back and forth for decades, proposing grand strategies.
Yeah.
Why couldn't they launch one successful, simultaneous, overwhelming attack?
The failure of the Franco-Mongol alliance stems from several profound logistical and cultural obstacles. First is the sheer logistical impossibility of 13th century cross-continental coordination.
Think about how long it takes a letter to cross Europe today. Now imagine doing that on horseback across hostile territory in the 13th century.
Messages between the Ilkhanate court in Persia and the royal courts in Paris or London took months, sometimes over a year, to travel one way.
So by the time a monarch receives a letter proposing an attack next spring, debates it with his nobles, raises taxes to fund an army, builds ships, and sails to the Levant, 3 years have passed.
Exactly. The strategic situation on the ground in Syria had completely changed by the time any European force arrived. The timing was physically impossible to synchronize.
But there was also a cultural barrier, wasn't there?
A huge one. The Mongols viewed diplomacy fundamentally differently than the Europeans did. As we discussed with Damascus, the Mongols did not truly understand or respect the concept of an ally in a partnership of equals.
Their diplomatic letters to Europe often blended offers of military cooperation with underlying highly arrogant demands for European submission to the Great Khan.
So the Pope is reading a letter that says, "Let us work together, but also recognize that God gave me dominion over the entire earth, including Rome."
That would certainly make European kings hesitate to commit their armies.
It created immense distrust. Additionally, the Crusader states actually living in the Levant, the barons in Acre and Tripoli, were deeply cautious.
Because they remembered that the Mongols had decimated Christian lands in Eastern Europe.
Right. Many Frankish barons preferred maintaining tense but stable passive truces with the Mamluks over trusting a massive, unpredictable Mongol army operating in their own backyard.
They feared the Mongols might wipe out the Mamluks and then simply turn around and conquer the Crusader cities next.
Which was a very valid fear.
So diplomacy fails to decisively shift the balance of power for the Mongols. They cannot secure a coordinated European armada, and the Mamluks successfully keep the Ilkhanate distracted with the threat of the Golden Horde to the north.
This means the conflict in the Levant inevitably returns to massive set-piece battles over the ensuing decades, as the Ilkhanate periodically tries to brute force its way into Syria.
This period is characterized by intense intermittent warfare. The borders remain highly volatile.
In 1281, the Mamluks achieve another major decisive victory at the Second Battle of Homs, successfully repelling a massive invasion force sent by Abaka Khan.
But the dynamic shifts significantly again in 1299 with the rise of a new Ilkhan, Ghazan Khan.
Ghazan is a pivotal figure in this conflict because he formally converts to Sunni Islam, and he requires his army to do the same.
This profoundly complicates the ideological narrative of the war.
It does. Previously, the Mamluks framed their war against the Mongols very clearly. It was a righteous, holy defense of Islam against pagan, barbarian invaders from the east.
Which gave the Mamluks immense legitimacy in the eyes of the Muslim world.
But Ghazan's conversion flips the script. Despite fighting the Muslim Mamluks, Ghazan frames his invasion not just as imperial expansion, but as a religious jihad.
He sends proclamations claiming the Mamluks are unjust, corrupt rulers who oppress their subjects, and that he, Ghazan, is the true, righteous defender of the Islamic faith coming to liberate Syria.
And in late 1299, Ghazan puts this ideology to the test and invades Syria with a massive army of nearly 100,000 men.
The Mamluks, now ruled by Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, marched north out of Egypt to meet him at the Battle of Wadi al-Khaznadar, located just north of Homs.
And at Wadi al-Khaznadar, the Mamluks suffer a severe and highly costly defeat.
What went wrong for them?
Well, the battle began with a traditional, devastating Mamluk heavy cavalry charge that actually broke the Mongol right wing. However, the Mongols under Ghazan utilized a massive, wide flanking maneuver that caught the Mamluks off guard.
So they got surrounded.
Combined with devastating, sustained archery volleys that depleted the Mamluk horses, the Mamluk lines eventually broke. The army collapsed into a disorganized, panicked retreat all the way back to the borders of Egypt.
This defeat leaves Syria completely wide open. There is no field army left to defend the cities. Ghazan marches south and occupies Damascus in early 1300.
The Mamluk administrative apparatus in the region totally collapses. After 40 years of trying, it seems like the Mongol goal of conquering and holding Syria has finally been achieved.
Yet the occupation fails almost as quickly as it began. By February of 1300, mere weeks after taking Damascus, Ghazan is forced to withdraw the vast majority of his army back across the Euphrates River into Persia.
Yeah.
Wait, why? He just won his biggest victory in 40 years. He shattered the Mamluk army. Why abandon the prize?
The invisible shield strikes again. It was winter. The massive Mongol horse herds quickly exhausted the available winter forage around Damascus.
They were literally stripping the bark off trees just to keep the animals alive.
Maintaining an army of nearly 100,000 men and hundreds of thousands of horses through a Syrian winter proved logistically unsustainable.
Plus, there were internal politics at play, right?
Always. Ghazan received urgent intelligence reports of instability on his eastern borders in Persia and potential threats from another Mongol faction, the Chagatai Khanate.
He had to pull his main forces back to address internal security and secure sustainable pastures for his herds.
He leaves behind a small garrison to hold the territory, but as soon as the main Mongol army leaves, the Mamluks simply march back into Damascus.
They sweep away the garrison and reclaim the city. Ghazan's great victory at Wadi al-Khaznadar yields absolutely no permanent territorial gains.
It demonstrates the ultimate futility of the Mongol campaigns in the region. They could win battles, but they could not hold the environment.
The final major confrontation of this long war occurs a few years later, in April 1303, at the Battle of Marj al-Safar, located just south of Damascus.
Ghazan sends another large army to retake Syria. The Mamluks meet them on the plain of Marj al-Safar.
And over the course of 3 days of intense, grueling fighting, the Mamluks execute a brilliant tactical maneuver. They intentionally create a gap, a deliberate weakness in their own defensive lines.
The Mongol troops had been fighting for days. They were exhausted, but more importantly, they were suffering from extreme thirst.
Because the Mamluks held the ground near a river.
Right. The Mongols saw the gap in the Mamluk line and pushed aggressively through it, believing it was a path to break the center and reach the water of the nearby stream.
It is exactly like a Venus flytrap. The Mamluks use the environment, the biological necessity of water, as bait.
Once the Mongols pushed through the gap and rushed blindly toward the stream to drink, the Mamluks closed the jaws.
They swing their flanks inward, surround the thirsty, disorganized Mongol troops, and slaughter them against the riverbank.
Marj al-Safar highlights the incredible, deeply ingrained resilience of the Mamluk military apparatus. Just 3 years prior, they had suffered a devastating, demoralizing rout at Wadi al-Khaznadar.
Yet their strict institutional discipline, their wealth from Egyptian agriculture that allowed them to buy new horses and armor,
And their continuous training allowed them to rapidly reorganize. They rebuilt their forces, marched back into Syria, and executed highly complex, disciplined maneuvers to secure a decisive counter-victory.
that resilience finally breaks the Ilkhanate's political will to conquer Syria. Following Marj al-Safar, the massive state-sponsored invasions cease.
The Ilkhans realize that pushing past the Euphrates is a drain on resources they can no longer afford. Eventually, the two sides sign the Treaty of Aleppo in 1323.
This formally ends the state of war, establishes diplomatic relations, and recognizes the Euphrates River as the permanent hard border between the two empires.
The physical fighting ceased, but the decades of constant warfare, the border raids, the sieges, and Baybar's scorched earth tactics left an indelible mark on the Levant.
Let's examine that aftermath, because the cost of this victory was staggering. The demographic and economic toll on Syria was catastrophic.
Cities like Aleppo, which had been subjected to repeated sieges and massacres, experienced sharp generational depopulation.
The vital trade routes that historically ran through Syria, connecting the Mediterranean to the east, were severely disrupted for decades due to the instability.
Because Syria was essentially a frontline war zone for 60 years, the center of regional power, wealth, and culture shifted firmly and permanently away from Damascus and Baghdad and relocated to Cairo, deep in the relative safety of Egypt.
There is a significant ongoing scholarly debate regarding the long-term civilizational impact of these invasions. For a very long time, the dominant historical perspective was the trauma hypothesis.
This argument suggests that the Mongol invasions, starting with the apocalyptic destruction of Baghdad in 1258, caused an enduring intellectual, scientific, and cultural decline across the Islamic world.
The theory posits that the sheer trauma of the devastation led the society to become more politically conservative, inward-looking, and culturally insular, prioritizing rigid defense over innovation.
It is very easy to see why that theory took hold in history books. The violence was apocalyptic in scale, whole libraries were dumped into the Tigris River.
But there is a revisionist perspective that pushes back hard against this idea of total civilizational decline.
The revisionist view argues that while the initial destruction of cities like Baghdad and Aleppo was immense and undeniable, the broader society did not simply stagnate and die.
The Mamluks, viewing themselves as the ultimate saviors and protectors of Islam, responded to the destruction by heavily endowing religious and civic institutions.
They built massive madrasas, highly advanced hospitals, and extensive public works. By the early 1300s, under rulers like Khalwan and al-Nasir Muhammad, there was actually a massive architectural and scholarly boom in Damascus, and especially Cairo.
They actively worked to preserve Islamic civilization. When scholars, jurists, and artisans fled the Mongol advance in Persia and Iraq, the Mamluks welcomed them into Egypt, funded their work, and integrated them into the state.
Exactly. The Mamluks effectively synthesized their own rigorous steppe military culture with traditional Islamic governance, bureaucracy, and high culture.
They created a highly effective, culturally rich, and incredibly wealthy state that endured for over 2.5 centuries until the Ottomans arrived.
Which brings up a fascinating contradiction.
If the Mamluks ultimately won the war, held the borders, stopped the Mongols, and fostered this massive cultural boom in Cairo, why is the Mongol invasion so often remembered in popular history purely as an apocalyptic end to Islamic civilization in the region?
Historical memory is frequently colored by the initial, most visceral shock. The psychological trauma of the fall of Baghdad, the eradication of the caliphate in 1258, was so profound, so unthinkable to the contemporaries who lived through it, that it cast a long, dark shadow over the subsequent 60 years of highly successful Mamluk resistance.
The narrative of unprecedented destruction is inherently powerful and memorable, but it often obscures the much more complex, slower reality of recovery, institutional adaptation, and ultimate military victory.
We are looking at a multi-generational conflict where the Mamluks prove that having absolute technological or numerical superiority does not guarantee victory if your army cannot biologically sustain itself in a hostile environment.
The Mongol invasions of the Levant perfectly illustrate that empires often falter not just by the sword of their enemies, but by the immovable constraints of geography, climate, and supply lines.
The intersection of steppe cavalry tactics, unyielding Mamluk discipline, severe logistical limits regarding water and forage, and complex inter-Mongol diplomacy ultimately saved the Levant from complete subjugation.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder for you listening. We discussed how Burt Khan of the Golden Horde converted to Islam and waged a brutal civil war on the Ilkhanate, forcing Hulagu to divert his attention and his best troops north.
Right.
If the Golden Horde had not engaged in that civil war, if they had remained a unified Mongol front, removing that crucial pressure off the Mamluk northern flank, would the Mamluk scorched earth tactics and military discipline have been enough to hold the line in Syria?
How much of history relies not on the strength, bravery, or tactics of the defender, but entirely on the internal, chaotic squabbles of the enemy?
It is a question that highlights the delicate, often highly chaotic nature of major historical turning points. When Qutuz ordered those Mongol envoys cut in half and their heads mounted on the Bab Zawela gate, he was not just rejecting a threatening letter.
He was betting the survival of his entire civilization, that the brutal Syrian environment, the discipline of his slave soldier regiments, and a little bit of geopolitical luck would hold back the greatest land empire in human history.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. learn history visually.